Genshin Impact's Miliastra Wonderland is pretty confusing at first glance if you are a complete beginner. But if you can break past the learning curve barrier, it's actually pretty damn fun, with a lot of creative freedom and even the potential to earn real passive income from it. Thanks to experimenting in there for weeks and help from highly skilled folks like fellow YouTuber MyPing0, who I partnered with for this video, I've learned quite a lot myself in a short time, and this video is designed to take you from knowing nothing at all up to being able to build your first level with a working shop, equipment, inventory, cool effects, and more. By the end, you'll be able to confidently build node graphs and understand them, so some of the more advanced tutorials out there will make sense to you. This is the Unlikely Genshin Gamer, and welcome to the Miliastra Academia. To those of you who may be waiting for my usual videos after such a long break, don't worry. The Luna 4 update is going to open up the floodgates. But for now, might I interest you in sticking around all the same, in case you like it? Or at least sharing with a friend. Now, the first step that you should take to begin your journey is to sign up at the Craftsperson Center at this rather hidden link in the description. Please note that this is not required to publish a Wonderland overall, so you can follow this tutorial right away, but you won't have access to the quizzes to level up your craftsperson rank or the data of how your Wonderlands perform until you do. If you choose to sign up, you'll have to provide your government ID. Seeing as there is real potential for you to create something awesome and be eligible to earn passive income from it, it seems like a valid request. If you agree, then go ahead and get that out of the way. The level system for a craftsperson starts from 1, a craftsman, up to 5, a descender or world maker. If you are any bit acquainted with Genshin's story, then you'll know that a descender is pretty damn powerful. You will have to work your way up to that level of world-making prowess, but this tutorial will get you at least halfway there. When you finish this tutorial, take the level 1 quizzes right away to get to 2, which is vital for your Wonderland stages to show up properly amongst the library of games. Without level 2, text won't appear properly. You can also visit the Miliastra manual for all the nodes and stuff at the Craftsperson Academy. Now, with all that preliminary stuff out of the way, it's time to actually start crafting. If you've never even opened the editor before or are daunted by the interface, don't worry. In your Genshin options panel, scroll to the bottom and open the My Miliastra Wonderland option. It will be available to you as soon as you reach Adventure Rank 5. In this screen, you can see your current craftsman level and you can begin a save. The files we're going to work with will be available in the Resource Center for you to download and use if you want to check out my exact setup. I'll go over how to import or export your own files a little later in the video. In the meantime, let's check out the interface. Now, I'm not sure if any of you guys are old enough to still remember those old Disney movies from like the 80s and 70s, where you could always tell the movable characters and objects apart from the immovable background in a scene. But I like to think that these 2 tabs of the Miliastra interface are for creating and tweaking the immovable background, and the other 2 are for designing the interesting parts you'll interact with, including monsters, items, and your character themselves. The first tab is the Terrain Editor, which is pretty much just for editing the flat ground, bodies of water, or getting rid of it altogether for those types of wonderlands that don't rely on actual terrain. It's also where you could change the sky settings, or let time stand still instead of move. I encourage you to play around with the options here and in the stage settings to get the sort of terrain and environment you're looking for. The next section is for really world building. The Entity Placement screen is for placing everything else actually. But some entities, as they are called, need to be tweaked in the prefab library before you can put them here if you want them to be interactive. There are a lot of different entities to choose from right now, and I imagine more will be added at later dates. So remember to utilize the search box to save time. The custom section up here is where the prefabs you'll configure in the next section will show up. Under that, you'll find the already prefabricated entities that you can place in the scene. Dynamic units here are actually configurable from this screen, unlike all the static units, which are just scenery, unless you manually change them like this. When placing and cultivating your dream map, it's helpful to know some tips for smoother execution. This icon here can be used to turn on the all-in-one transformation tool or restrict it to one type only. If you run into an annoying snapping problem from the entity not letting you move it precisely, play around with these settings up here. I find that turning off center align is very useful. Play around with these to make some very interesting setups. Also, I want you to take special note of the terminology that I'm using for different aspects of the interface because they are important. I'm not saying items here when referring to these units and such, which might seem interchangeable, but items are very specific things in Miliastra. They are largely the things that can be added to your inventory for use or to sell later, and they can't simply exist in the 3D space without being packaged as loot. More on that later. Most things count as entities. Then there are also creations, which are the monsters, villains, and animals. And there is also loot. What's cool is that you can later configure interactions in the world with other entities or creations to lead to you getting items or loot, which we will cover shortly. For now, I just want you to not get confused by the terminology. Now, about the Prefab Library and the Combat Preset section. As far as game types go, an RPG game, which is what we'll be working on, consists of a world for your avatar to run around in and eventually interact with for better or for worse. In the Miliastra system, the main ways we do this is through tabs and collisions. Those, along with a host of other customizations, get dealt with in the Prefab Library, where you will customize those previously static entities into something you can interact with. We'll touch on the combat preset section in this video, but for more detail, I encourage you to check out the content from fellow Miliastra guide MyPing0 once you've done with this video. He gets into this more deeply, and you'll have a strong foundation to build on going from here to there. What we will be addressing in this section, a little later, are items, equipment, and currency. Here in the Prefab Library, though, is where part 1 of the juicy stuff begins. Priming your entities to receive logic from the sandbox. We'll go over tabs and collisions, and then, just to make sure you're armed with the tools to make something fun, we'll touch on VFX and motion devices, and even timers as well. But I promise it won't be overwhelming. A tab is the option box that appears next to something when you want to choose to interact with it, like picking up mint and berries in the world of Genshin. Let's make a spooky tree that we can interact with to demonstrate all 4 of the components I mentioned, starting with a tab. Choose a tree of your liking, or really any object, from the basic module section over here. Please note that if you decide to start with an entity that is a weird size, like this circular stone, change the size first before adding the tab component, because it gets kind of weird if you do it afterwards. Now let's set up this tree. I've chosen this pretty lavender one. Very unassuming, right? Over on the right, you'll see a bunch of info pertaining to it. The transform section obviously pertains to how to change its size and rotation and such. You can also decide if the entity will be climbable, whether you can bump into it or just go right through, or even if it's invisible. But if you look at the top under the name of the unit, you'll see 4 sections overall. You want to go to the one that looks like a piece of Lego, which is where we'll be able to add interactive components to the unit. Most entities come preloaded with containers for VFX, custom variables, and status effects or unit status. This doesn't mean that they have any special effects or so already loaded on, but rather, if you wanted to add one through the node graph instead, when the graph talks to this entity or queries it, yo, do you have a container for me to play some VFX from? The entity can send back and say, yeah, we do. Go ahead. So we'll leave them there. Now we're going to add a container for a tab and configure it. At the bottom of the screen, click Add Common Component, and you'll see many to choose from and play around with when you get a chance. We want the one at the top, a tab. The tab has an address now, which is tab ID 1. It also has a trigger option area, which tells the system where a character has to be to trigger the tab to appear. Click Advanced Editing so we can tweak the tab, like choosing an icon. I'm going to keep mine at the chat bubble, but there are quite a few to choose from. And I'm going to call it her. Nice and creepy. The sort level matters if you have other tabs in the area or on the same entity to sort which one is at the top of the list and when they appear. Remember how annoying it used to be to go to the alchemy table in Mondstadt and accidentally start a conversation with Timaeus instead of using the table? It's because the sorting level had Timaeus first. For more info on local filter and filter node graph, check this video by MyPing0 on tabs. The other thing we need to check is the trigger option area. We can set how large and the shape of the area that the character has to be in to trigger the tab. Make it a comfortable size, either by typing in a number or manipulating the XYZ arms on the entity itself after selecting Zoom Multiplier. There, you just set up a tab. It doesn't do anything yet because we haven't made a graph for it, but it's there to be referenced. Save the prefab you've just made with a name you'll remember, and you can assign it to a folder to keep the prefab library tidy. By extension, you have essentially made a collision trigger as well. Sort of. A collision trigger component is simply the trigger area of a tab component, but without the tab. Instead of a tab appearing when you enter this space, you'd configure something else to happen in the node graph, using one of the nodes specifically for collisions instead of one for tabs. But both build on the concept of a character or entity colliding with this invisible area that will start off a chain reaction. In this tutorial, to also touch on VFX and motion devices, we're going to make this tree also have a dedicated collision trigger that will cause a special effect to happen and make something move when we get near enough to the tree. So, go back to the component section and add a collision trigger. In the collision trigger, you want to set the size of it. Choose to make only characters be effective targets so that a wandering boar or slime couldn't set it off. And make sure initially effective is on, so it's ready and listening right away. Sometimes you don't want that to be the case, so you can set up a precise chain of events, but right now we do. Since we already have a VFX container waiting on the entity, we'll be able to start it via the node graphs in a second. But first we need to configure one more entity so I can demonstrate to you a basic motion device. What if we decided to make it so that when we go and talk to her, the tree makes a weird little stool appear, just rising up out of the ground nearby? What we can do to accomplish this is to choose a static unit like before. I'm choosing this stone stool. Then go back to the component section of this entity to add a different component. We'll link the stool to the tree in the node graphs. Choose the basic motion device component. Since we want the device to activate when we come close to the tree, we don't want to add a collision trigger to the stool. We want it to stay on the tree. Open the advanced editing section so we can configure how fast and far this stone stool will move. Also, you can change the name of the device to something we can easily remember to reference it in the node graphs. Make sure that initially effective isn't on this time so that it won't come on until we tell it to. Right here, we can choose from a few different movement types. For now, we're just going to choose uniform linear because we simply want it to slide upwards. Then, you want to play around with the values in these boxes that will decide how fast and far it goes. If you choose the duration to be 3 seconds, and then choose, say, 3 in the destination segment, then the velocity will be automatically calculated to be 1 unit per second. Click Preview Current Motion so you can see what your settings look like. You can use this configuration I have here for the stool. It works well for when the top of the stool is just under the surface of the ground. Of course, save your prefab. Now, to recap, we should have our tree with a tab component, a collision trigger component, and it came preloaded with a VFX container, which we need. Secondly, now we've programmed a stone stool to rise out of the ground when its basic motion device is activated. We need to place them in our scene now back in the entity placement section. Make sure you sink the stool into the ground at the right depth, so when you preview its motion, it ends where you want it to. You can preview it from this screen to see how it fits in with everything. Time to open up the Miliastra Sandbox. It normally automatically opens when you start the Miliastra editor, but if not, then you can find it again here. Although the node system is called a graph, you can also think of it like a map. The nodes are stops along paths that eventually lead to the destination. Logic is the basis of math, since 1 + 1 must equal 2. In this way, what occurs in the map or graph has to happen one after the other, and only if it's allowed to. The nodes can go from simple to complex, depending on what you need, and that's the real powerhouse letting us literally program games. But it's loads easier than actual programming language. Now, you'll notice here a number of folders. These are the different shelves, so to speak, where node graphs can be found when the system asks for them. Different things sometimes call for different shelves. We'll be staying in the server folder and in the item and entity subfolders when designing our graphs for now. Let's start with the collision trigger we put on the tree. Right-click here to create a new node graph, and then right-click it to change its name to something you will remember, like Tree Collision Effect. Inside, by right-clicking, you'll notice a number of different categories. There are events, which tell the system to listen out for an event from in the game. That's what we'll need right now, to tell it to listen for when a collision trigger is, well, triggered. There are also execution ones that make something happen because of the event. We'll definitely need that too. So type here collision so we can quickly find what we need, since there are a lot of nodes. There. When entering collision trigger. Then, since one of the things we want to happen is that a spooky effect plays, we'll need to get a VFX node. Something you need to know about special effects is that there are two kinds, and therefore two different nodes for them. Timed effects or looping effects. Since what we want is something like the black field that appears around something bad in Genshin sometimes, we need to choose looping. Type in VFX so we see the different ones, and then choose Mount Looping Special Effect. Looks complex, but it's not. There's a specific way to hook everything up, which makes sense once you know it. To tell the system that one thing happens before the other is with the big connector up here. Now we need to specify what's going on. The other options on the collision trigger node pertain to letting the system know the specifics. Entering entity would mean who came into the range of the trigger. We'll leave it blank because that's going to tell the system that anything or anyone that has been allowed to enter the trigger can start the chain reaction. But say you wanted to make sure only a very specific thing or player could, then you would need to specify. Entering entity GUID is how you would tell it to listen for a specific entity, which brings me to a point that you must take note of going forward. Almost all the entities, items, creations, user interface components, and so forth have ID numbers, which we can use to reference them in the node graph. When a prefab has been set up and configured and then placed in the entity placement screen, it gains a GUID that is unique. If you add another copy of the entity somewhere else, it will have a different one. These GUIDs let you have complete control over what causes what to happen. So if I want to make another creepy ass tree come sliding into this collision trigger and it only fires off at that point, I'd use a query node, which is how you answer a question the system is asking. Who exactly is allowed to set this off? Tell me the GUID. Very handy. I'll show you it in action in a moment when we tell the tree to turn on the stone stool. Now, next is the trigger entity. This we will be using. We will connect this option to the option on the VFX node called target entity, which is to say, I want you to put the VFX I'm setting up on the same entity that has the trigger I'm talking about. Otherwise, I could maybe instead want to have an explosion happen somewhere else, like designating an annoying boar somewhere to be the target entity. That's why query nodes, the blue ones, are so useful. But for now, let's hook things up like this so we have the effect on the tree. Now, on the VFX node, we need to tell it which effect we want. Even VFX have identity numbers. But for the benefit of us humans, they also have names we can search for. Going forward, I would love to see either a library or a better categorization system be implemented so we don't have to browse through hundreds of them to see what they look like. To find out which one you may like, click the play button next to the effect and look for the visuals in the prefab screen. Or you could check them out ahead of time like this. Just remember to return the VFX container to being blank again, so there are no conflicts in the system. I like how black prompt looks, so let's find it in the node's drop-down menu. Click the magnifying glass and search for it. The number gets added, and now the system knows which effect to play. The next options say where to anchor it. So for example, if I wanted this thing to appear maybe up in the branches instead, I would use a different attachment point. But for now, I'm going to use GI root node. You do have to type this very specifically, and I hope in the future they change this to a drop-down menu which will reduce errors. You can see the spelling of different attachment points here in the VFX section on the entity. Move or rotate with the target are self-explanatory. Good if you want a moving, glowing effect or so. And the offsets, again, pertain to the position of the effect, but more precisely. We want it to be simply at the root, so we'll put 0 for all of them. We'll choose 1 for the zoom multiplier because its normal size is fine, and we'll leave the sound it naturally makes on. The whole node graph, as simple as it is complete. Let's test it. Save it, and we need to mount it onto the tree that we put the collision trigger on. Go back to the Prefab library and click the 4th tab on our tree, which shows a node graph. Then add the graph we made. Save the prefab again. Make sure you've placed it in the entity placement screen. If you've already done so, then saving it will update it wherever it is. Now test play. Click the grid in the corner again and choose test play. No need to render, just choose direct play, then start game. Run over to the entity we set up and see if the effect happens. Great. You may notice that the tab that we configured appears too, but if we select it, nothing will happen because we didn't set it up yet. Let's go back in and finish with the rest of what the collision trigger is supposed to do before moving on to the tab. We want to make the stone stool rise out of the ground after the black barrier appears. So, the next node we want, which is an execution node as well, would be an Activate Motion Device node. This node will reference a name instead of a number, so make sure you type it in here correctly. And then, to tell it exactly which entity we want it to play out on, we're going to use one of those handy query nodes to answer the question of who the target entity is. Remember the GUIDs I told you about? Get the one belonging to the stone stool that you've placed in the scene. And we're going to paste that into a Query Entity by GUID node. Use that to define the target entity and then connect the main path between the VFX node from before and the motion one. Now let's check out our coding job. Excellent. Coding the tab should be even faster now that you're getting the hang of it. Since we want the tab to hand us an item when we activate it, it's time to finally visit the Combat Preset section before we actually make a node graph for the tab. Here in the Combat Preset section, most of the categories have to do with combat, but at the bottom on the left, you'll see this icon for items. Choose Add New Item. You can choose the icon that will appear in the backpack, the name, rarity, and whether or not it's a normal item or it's equipment. Equipment is a special kind of item which can actually affect our character, so we'll go in more depth on them in a bit. For now, choose normal item. Since we're going to get this from a creepy tree, I'm going to go with the bottle of green liquid. Over on the right, we can define a lot of things about this item, like how many we can have, what category it belongs to, or even give it a dedicated node graph so that, for example, something special can happen when it's used. You can also define its currency value for a shop or how it works as loot. Later in the video, we'll address currency and loot, so you can sell this item to a shop if you like, or designate it as loot. But for now, just select that it has no currency value and give it a name and a description if you like. Make sure you save it. Now we must do one more thing before items will work for us, which is to give the character an inventory. A character needs an inventory to pick up or receive items at all. So let's add a component to your character just like we added them to the prefabs. While we're at it, I want you to take note of this distinction right here. Player versus character. Every player in the game has a character, which is the avatar you get to dress up and customize. That two-part system is important, and some nodes need to talk only to the character, such as ones editing your inventory or checking to see if you triggered something, while others need to speak specifically with the player, that is the background of that character, such as to edit the player's score because of something the character did. It can be confusing at first, but it's an important distinction to make. And it tripped me up quite a bit in the early days. Since an inventory lives on our character instead of the player, we'll want to select the Edit Character tab to give them an inventory. After you add an inventory, there's a bit we have to do so the game knows how the inventory should work. For more in-depth knowledge on how inventories work and how to tweak them, check out the MyPing0's video on items in the description. For now, you can get by selecting the default inventory template that is built into the editor at the start. Now your character has a working inventory and we have an item to put in it. Time to hook up the logic. Start with a different node graph and a different name. Then we'll add a When tab is selected node. And because what we want to happen is that the character gains the weird liquid into their inventory, then we will need the execution node Modify Inventory Item Quantity to take the item amount from 0 to 1, or however many you want. In this section, you'll add the ID number of the item you want to go into the inventory. You can find it right here. Then, if nothing further should happen, including you don't want this action to be able to happen again, we need to deactivate the tab. We'll use an Activate/Deactivate tab node and tell it to turn off the tab once everything has happened. Remember to hook up your target entities properly. The inventory owner entity is the entity that selected the tab. And the target entity for the tab deactivation is the tab we started with. You can match tab IDs as well here, or you can leave it blank because there is only one tab component on the tree anyway. Now, save the graph and let's check our logic. Mount the node graph onto the tree like before. And now we can test play. Don't forget to save the updated prefab. If we check the inventory ahead of time, we don't have the item. And after talking to the tree, we do. Great. So far, so good. Now, let's incorporate buying and selling and a bit of looting, while also touching on equipment. Back to the combat presets section. You've already learned about items since we've made a tab component on the tree give us one. Another kind of item is equipment, which is basically items that can change your character in some sort of way, differently than you might do with a node graph alone. Grabbing a sword from a chest could easily enough cause you to level up or change classes using the corresponding nodes. But equipables could also be configured to give the character an HP boost, elemental effect, attack bonus, or more through affixes, which are unique to equipment. Two setting pop-ups pertain to equipment. The first is equipment slot, similar to your inventory, but just for equipment. So you could define specific categories of equipment, like say perhaps swords, bows, armor, and spells. You can change the icon you want to use to define it, and you would specify what types of equipment can be slotted there during the game. Since we're going to make a rear sword, let's create an equipment slot with a category for rear weapons. This template, just like the inventory template from earlier, will be assigned to our character with a component. The other pop-up, called Manage Equipment Data, is where you will define affixes, tags, and types. Types is where you will define the types of weapons that can go into the slots you've created. You just create a type, and then in the equipment slot section, you'll assign the type to a slot. In affixes is where the real fun is. You can add an affix, give it a name, and then define what it can do for a character when the equipment hosting it is equipped or obtained. There is a lot more that can be discussed about equipment, but I'll leave the extra to myping0. Check out his video about equipment and items to learn more. For now, I'll get you up and running with the equipment itself, or this video would become far too long. To finish our budding narrative, we will gain a ceremonial blade, which will cause a special chest to appear, which you will loot to get some currency. Then, you'll use your hard-won gains to purchase a special item from the shop, which will complete the game. So, hang in there. Let's create the sword equipment first and proceed from there. In the item screen, make a new item. Call it Rear Sword. We'll tweak its basic settings in a minute, but for now, check out the interaction settings. We need to give it a type, and we also want to give it an affix. Click the location icon to configure a type. We'll call it Rear Weapons. Then go ahead and assign it. Okay, now let's add an affix. Click Add Affix and open the Equipment Affix Editor. Then add affix. As you can see, the options are extensive. We'll set the effective timing to be when equipped. Let the affix type be a base attribute bonus. Our ceremonial blade gives us more courage, so let's up our HP. That means the attribute will be HP correction value. We'll keep it fixed rather than a percentage value, just for simplicity's sake, and you can set the value as you like. So I'm choosing 2000. You can add a description or not. Otherwise, this affix is ready to be attached to the weapon. Assign the affix and save the equipment. Go back to the equipment slot editor and assign the weapon type Rear Weapons to the category we made. Now, weapons with the type Rear Weapons, and only those, will be allowed to be slotted into this equipment inventory. Lastly, we need to assign the equipment inventory to the character just like a normal inventory. Add the component equipment slot and assign the slot you have made. Now, before we can test if it does what it should, we need a container for it, which brings us to loot. Loot is quite simple. Items, as you may have noticed, don't have a corresponding 3D model in the game until you create one in the form of loot. You probably could add a node graph to every destroyable entity in your game and have them give you a particular item when they are gone, but that would be very time-consuming and clunky. Not to mention, the loot and trophy systems work well with all sorts of currency and items. If you've ever played main Genshin and seen artifacts fall on the ground from destroying monsters or opening chests, they appear in these weird little capsule-like things. That's a loot container. And it's very easy to set up. Go to the Prefab Library and on the left choose Loot icon. A primo gem in a box, I guess. Pick the preset loot, which is an adventure coin. Please note for a second that some entities have preset statuses, which can be very useful. This one right now can either be spinning or not, based on the preset status. And we can change the preset in the node graphs. We'll be using that in a minute to set up a chest. Now, if you don't want the loot container to be a coin, that's fine. You can click Main Object Model and then choose whatever you like. I'm going to use this training dummy. There isn't a lot you can program onto loot, but you will want to program its trigger area, which will make the built-in tab appear for pickup, and the entity will automatically be destroyed afterwards. If you explore some of the other options, you might see a cool effect. Make sure the trigger area is to your liking. And then add the item that this loot container is going to give you, which is the sword. Save it. Now we can put this entity in the scene, and when we run up to it and interact, we'll get our rare sword. That would also be when we check to see if our sword does what it should. Let's test it out. Press C to see that we have an equipment slot waiting for the sword. And then let's go over to the training dummy to get it. Equip it. And yep, we got the HP boost. Great. Now, let's get fancy so we can finish up the story. Time to define our game's money. In the main menu, navigate to Currency and Inventory. Same spot where you set up your inventory earlier. Click Add Currency. Choose a name and an icon. There aren't many, but these will suffice. Now you know what the loot setting down here is for, and the other settings aren't necessary for this tutorial. Check out the description for the full list of videos that will give you further knowledge, including my Ping Zero's video on loot mechanics. Since you probably don't want the loot container for money to look like a training dummy though, we'll just make another loot container. I'm gonna make it a smaller coin than normal. Set up the trigger area and save it as loot as well. Now we have 2 loot containers to choose from. Time for the chest and how to make the sword bring it into being. Pick a chest of your liking. Notice the preset values here for open and closed. Add a tab component and tweak its trigger area so we can interact with the chest at all. Now, add a trophy component. Designating something a trophy means, by default, when the item is destroyed at all, the defined loot container will appear for you to take. Now, we edit the trophy setting to hold some currency. Pick what the container looks like and what's in it. We'll use combined drops for now and set it to 500 coin. Save the chest and let's go get fancy in the node graphs. Remember, all the graphs, entities, and items in this tutorial will be available in the Resource Center for you to pick apart. Start with a tab event. Then we want a change preset status node, which will change the preset status of the chest to simulate it swinging open. Then we need to add a destroy entity node to make the chest disappear so the loot appears. Target entity are all the event source, meaning the chest. And if you check on the model again, you can find the preset status index. We want the status to change to 1 since 1 means open. Save the graph and mount it on the chest. Then put it in the scene and see what happens. Okay, so the loot appeared all right, and when we pick it up, we get the 500 currency. But if you ask me, the chest disappears way too fast. We don't even get to see it open. So, I'm going to set a timer to make things a bit slower. It's not complex, therefore I'm not going to expressly explain it here, but there will be a link to a video that does. Back to the node graph. Disconnect the destroy node. We're going to place a timer at the end of this line instead. We'll need to define the second count, and to do that, we'll use an assembly list node. It's a very handy node for designating a value, or a set of them. And when attached to a timer node like this, its increments are seconds. I'm going for 1 second. Give the timer a name and don't loop it. Now, on the same node graph, get another event called when timer is triggered, which means when the silent countdown is finished, start an event. And we'll define which timer and say destroy the entity afterwards. Okay, now test again. And voila, there's a delay before the chest is destroyed. Okay, now let's make our sword be able to create this prefab we just made. It's very simple. We just need to go to the item node graph section instead of the entity one, since we want to speak to an item, not an entity. We want to use a when item is equipped node, and we'll link it to a create prefab node. Link them together, and in the prefab ID section, get the ID number of the chest prefab, not its GUID, which is specific to when it's already in the scene. We are telling the sword to reference this prefab and put it in the scene. To find out where, I suggest putting one in the scene temporarily, just where you would want it to appear, and grab those exact coordinates, like this. Add these numbers to the location and rotation areas of the node. As for the other settings, don't worry about them for now. Save the graph and mount it on the sword here in Basic Settings of the equipment. Save it and test. We get our sword from the dummy, and when we equip it, the chest appears. It's kind of bland without any VFX, but you can add that if you want. And the newly created entity has all the properties we programmed into the prefab before. Okay, we're in the home stretch of this demonstration now. All we have left is a shop to sell our sword and liquid to, so that together with the money we will loot from the chest, we can buy our way to victory. Let's go back to the prefab library and create a shop, which is very easy. Choose a building you like, or a bush, or a bucket, for that matter. They can all hold the component for a shop, even a creation like a treasure hoarder. Then we'll add a component just like for the tab or the collision trigger, called Shop. It already comes built in with a nice looking interface for receiving items and displaying what it has for sale. Click Advanced Editing so you can name the shop and configure its unique inventory style. Just like the character inventory and the equipment slot, the shop template defines what can go in and out of the shop. You can also define prices here too. Click New Shop Template and give it a name. Let's make a custom store tab. Think of it as an aisle in the store and call it Game End Items. Next, we are going to make the sale settings be custom list because we're going to give the shop a special item to sell, which will cause the stage to be settled. In the custom list, add the liquid and the rare sword, but set them to not purchasable. This is because we don't want you to be able to buy these things from the shop to cheat the level, but because we want the shop to be able to buy them from you, we will then go down to the purchase settings and manually select that the shop can purchase those same items for their listed price. So, it can't sell them, but it can buy them. Assign this shop template to the component and we'll create the one special thing it will sell in a moment. Now, to interact with a shop, you actually need to add a tab component, which we will configure to open a shop. So, add a tab component to this prefab the way we've been doing thus far. Name it what you like, and so forth, just like before. Make sure to define the trigger area. Then we head back to the sandbox. After grabbing a tab event, the execution node we're going to want is the Open Shop node. And it's one of those ones that prefers to talk to the player, not the character. So, there is a handy node for this called Get Player Entity to which character belongs. It basically converts the character into the player so the next node understands what to do. So the player that belongs to this character that selected the tab is who the shop will be interacting with. And the shop owner entity is the same entity that the tab is on. So that's the event source entity. Mount the node graph on the prefab, save it, and place it in the scene somewhere. Time to test to make sure we can trigger and open the shop. Great. Nothing in there, but it's open. Now, let's make the victory box. You should have the method for making an item down now. Combat preset. I'll use the reliquary box. And it needs to be really special. Give it a description maybe, like this. And now we're going to add a specialized node graph, just like the sword that spawned a chest, to make this box settle the stage when we open it. In the sandbox, over on the left, we need to go into the folder for the item node graphs again. Find the when item is used node and the settle stage node. Hook them up like so, and then let's test it out. Okay, everything worked. You have just made your first Miliastra stage. You should now know enough to take the quiz to go to level 2, and then publish your first stage to get enough plays for level 3 and 4. Share your creations in the comments so I can check them out and give them a few plays to help you level up. And as promised, I'll show you how to export your own files or import others for even more possibilities. The link to the Wonderland Resource Center is in the description and in the Miliastra editor itself. You can either import entire complete stages like this by looking for the file name to end in .gil, or go to Manage Asset Import Export to import or export assets of a level, which will be .gaia files. Both file types need to be placed in a specific folder, so take note when using any of these methods. Check out the tutorial stage, which has a few extras included for you to explore, at the link in the description. Thanks for making it all this way, and I really hope you all enjoyed this tutorial. It's the kind I wished had been around when I was getting started, which would have saved a lot of headaches. Share this video with a friend if you enjoyed it, and give it a hype and a like if you found it helpful. Thanks again.